series of events that we had for Black History Month at the Wilmington Institute Libraries. And to conclude our festivities, we have acclaimed culinary historian and scholar, Mr. Adrian Miller. Welcome, Mr. Miller.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Mr. Miller is a fellow Denverite. We're from the same city, and I had an opportunity to meet him in the infancy of his first book. I got to meet him before he was famous.
A while ago, yeah.
Yes, yes. But anyway, to begin our conversation, because we're doing two things. We're going to be talking about the Black culinary tradition, specifically barbecue, to promote your new book that will be released in April called Black Smoke.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what I would like to open up our conversation, I years ago, Maya Angelou had come out with a book of recipes. It was called Hallelujah, the Welcome Table.
Mm-hmm.
And something that, she said that really struck a chord, she had recalled how, she was sexually violated as a young girl. And she remembers when her grandmother, had found out about it, her grandmother did not, sit and speak to her about the incident, but what she noticed when she got home was her grandmother had baked her favorite cake and sat it on the table. And so, to open up our conversation, would you talk about the Black culinary traditions, specific to how we show love to one another and how we use food to deal with trauma?
Yeah. So, the story of soul food itself is one of a story of resiliency, ingenuity, and ultimately triumph, right? That the fact that the very worst circumstances have been put in our way and we're still here. We're
Mm-hmm.
surviving, in some cases thriving, but still striving, right? Because we want to be full participants in this society. And we know the recent events remind a lot of people that we're not there yet. But yeah, so when I think of soul food, I think of comforting. I think of a caregiver, making food to comfort me, nourish me, because cooking is an act of love. When somebody cooks for you, they're saying, I love you, right? Even if the
Wow.
food is straight nasty, the fact that they have gone through that process
Mm-hmm.
is meaningful. And when you sit down at a table, you connect with the people around that table. You recognize each other's humanity. You see the divine in each other. And so I think there's something to the fact about having a meal together. And, in terms of expressions of love, just the cooking of the food, but specifically in soul food culture, I'll give one example: the corner piece. Whenever you get the corner piece of cobbler or cornbread, that African
The
American
goodies.
person, yeah, they're telling you they love you, even if there's
Yeah.
no other sign of affection that's apparent. They're saying I love you. So getting the big piece, Chris Rock had the routine about getting the big piece of chicken for the father in the family. So there's all of these things that we attach to food, and they're rituals that are can be very family specific as well, that bring that to the fore.
Wow. Well, wonderful. And so, what was your impetus in writing Black Smoke? Why did you choose to go the barbecue route this time?
Yeah. So it's not something I had first intended, but it was basically 2004. I was watching the Food Network, and they had this special, and I'm gonna go talk a little bit more about this. But there was a special by Paula Deen on it's called Paula's Southern Barbecue, and I watched that. And after watching that, I said I need to write a book about African American barbecue because there were no African Americans featured. And then I just started looking at a food media, and it was the same thing: print, TV, anything that was about barbecue just didn't have very many African Americans, which did not square with my experience because barbecue is a huge part of African American culture. So I wanted to write a book that was part celebration and restoration of African American barbecue culture.
Well, with that said, we'll just let you go ahead and begin your short presentation that you have for us.
Okay.
And at the end of the presentation, we want this to be interactive as possible. So if any of you have any questions, just feel free to just say something to us in the chat line, and then we will give you an opportunity to turn on your camera or to unmute yourself to speak directly to Mr. Miller.
All right, I'm gonna share my screen here. So this is me in one of my favorite barbecue restaurants. I don't know if you had a chance to go here when you were back in Denver, but it was called Boney's
Yes.
Barbecue Smokehouse.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So here's the sad thing: Boney's, because of the pandemic, it closed, which is
Mm.
it's a cautionary tale for what's going on with African American barbecue. So uh, everybody online here, you're getting a sneak preview because the book does not come out till April 27th. So I'm giving you some secrets. So I hope you enjoy it. And if something doesn't ring true, I guess it's too late for me to change it in the book. But I can keep it in mind for future editions. So this is the cover: Black Smoke, African Americans in the United States Barbecue. You can see the book cover is essentially an African American cutting up a slab of ribs. And to me, ribs are one of the most iconic aspects of African American barbecue culture. All right, so how it started, we just talked about that a second ago. So yeah, in the late '90s, early 2000s, the Food Network really attached itself to the kind of growing popularity of barbecue. So they had a lot of barbecue programming, but mostly Bobby Flay was the cornerstone of it. But in 2004, they took a big turn and basically really upped their programming. And so I watched this Paula's Southern Barbecue. And, I'm sitting there and I just thought, hey, let me understand more about barbecue in the South. And I just thought that I was going to get a nice kind of exposure. And then when the credits were rolling 60 minutes later, she had not talked to one African American. So I was just sitting there going, how does this even happen? And so again, I just started looking at other barbecue media and I noticed that African Americans had been pushed to the sidelines. And I wanted to explore more. And so after exploring more, my conclusion is this: barbecue media has fallen deeply in love with white dudes, and it's really a certain type of white dude. So you've got the Bubba type, the rural character that shows up in all kinds of shows, right? Duck Dynasty, Moonshiners, they're all kind of the same dude. You also got the hipster, with interesting tattoos, facial hair, glasses. You've got the kind of competitive barbecue person. So this show, Barbecue Pitmasters, this picture captures three of the four that I identified, and the other one is the white, is the kind of the fine dining chef, because fine dining chefs are now in barbecue in a way that they weren't before, deeply
Mm.
involved with barbecue. So the question was, well, what has been the African American role in barbecue? So this is a picture from Harper's Weekly in 1895, and this was something called the Atlanta Exposition. And if you look at this in the middle there, you've got two African American men who are basically flipping a whole hog, and their job was to dig that pit or trench, fill it up with hard wood, set it on fire until it got to burnt hardwood burning coals, to butcher the animals, to put poles in the side so that they can be flipped. And you see an older African American man who's kind of telling them what to do. And you see on the left hand side, or I'm sorry, on the right hand side, you can see an African American guy with a shovel bringing over fresh coals. So this was what barbecue was like for most of the 1700s and 1800s. It was whole hog cooking, cooked this way, but it was very African American centric. Almost all the newspapers, magazines, and anything that were depicting barbecue at that time centered it on African Americans. Now let's fast forward to 2003, when Bon Appetit magazine had a feature called Who's Who in American Barbecue. And if you're looking at this, if you look in, you can squint as much as you want, but you're not going to see any African Americans in this. There's only one woman, and there's an Asian American man, but no African Americans. So the question is, how do we get from a very Afrocentric view of barbecue to this one that's so white dominated? And so my book, Black Smoke, charts this phenomenon and really just shows how up until the 1980s, it was no big deal to include African Americans in any story about barbecue, but that started to change in the 1990s. So my book goes through how that changed. And so one thing that I do in my book, which you don't see in other books, is I root it in Native American culture. So my argument is that African American barbecue, sorry, not just African American, but barbecue in general, is rooted in Native American smoking practices. So what I did is I looked at the earliest sources from European travelers in the what we call the American South to see what they said about how Native Americans were smoking meat. And so one tradition is piercing sticks. So what they would do is they would kill an animal, cut up the meat somehow, and then they would pierce it with sticks and then aim it towards the fire. So it was a very slow type of cooking. Another kind was the rotating spit. Now, Europeans would have been very familiar with the spit because that was something that was very common in Europe. But you see that in the Americas as well. Another one was the raised platform. So this was actually setting up a series of sticks vertically, fork sticks to basically hold other sticks, and then you would create a lattice pattern so that you could lay your food on top of there. So this may seem like fast grilling, but actually the raised platform was usually a much higher over the flame, and it was a very slow cooking process. I mean, we have descriptions of it taking even more than a day to prepare meat this way. And you have to think, the idea was not immediate consumption, right? Not immediate feasting. The idea was to preserve this for later use. So the smoking was really just trying to create something preserved for later use. And then we've got the earth oven, and essentially that's digging a vertical hole, putting a fuel source at the bottom and lighting it up. And usually they put stones there because they would retain the heat more. And then you would layer vegetation and meat. And then when you got to that top layer, you would cover everything up with ground and then let it cook overnight. And then you would come over the next day, shovel off the dirt or the leaves or whatever you had to cover it. Because again, you wanted to keep animals from digging in there and helping themselves before you got to it. And then you would eat that. So that was an earth oven. And we see earth ovens around the world. But the one that I think that immediately leads to what we call barbecue is the smoking tradition involving the shallow pit. So if you didn't want to dig a deep vertical hole, you could dig a depression in the ground and fill that up with coals, and then you would put the meat either right on the coals, or you would create some kind of lattice pattern to raise the meat above that. And so to me, this is what leads us to barbecue, because eventually Europeans took the slow cooking traditions of Native Americans and then added their own kind of grilling traditions. And then when they did this, we start getting what we call barbecue. And then later, enslaved Africans get thrown into the mix. And so barbecue becomes what that picture I showed you from the Atlantic Monthly in the late 1800s. Okay, so the way that I talk about the book is I talk about the Native American roots, and then I just talk about how barbecue gets ingrained in African American culture. So I talk about essentially enslaved African Americans in the late 1700s and early 1800s become the go-to cooks for barbecue. In fact, most descriptions of barbecues have African Americans doing the cooking, and the people reporting on these events, make it known that African Americans were doing the work. It's really only until, let me just back up for a second. It's really only until the late 1800s that we start to see more white men getting into barbecue. And that reflects the tradition from barbecue from being a rural thing to more of an urban phenomenon. So that's where we go from whole animal cooking, and that whole animal could be a pig, could be a cow. Usually the cows were cut up in quarters because they're quite big, or a sheep. And those things were the ones cooked. But when barbecue moves from being rural setting where you're out in a nice meadow with that trench and you're cooking all these animals to to an urban setting where it's more of an emphasis on smaller cuts of meat, the pits are no longer dug in the ground, but they're artificial concrete bricks, things like that. That's where we start to see the emphasis on smaller cuts of meat. We start to see more white men involved in barbecue. So the next thing I talk about is just kind of how does barbecue play out in African American culture? So barbecue was a big part of the Black church culture because barbecue demanded community. Whenever you cooked a whole pig, that's a lot of meat, man. So you had to get people together to make sure you could eat all that because there wasn't refrigeration. There was no way they could save that. So you didn't want anything to go to waste. And so Black churches really figured this out. I would say that politicians and clergy were the ones that really used barbecue to their advantage in terms of creating a following. So here's an ad from a barbecue in, of all places, Minnesota. Oh, no, sorry, Montana. And this was from the early 1900s. And so, and it's not a pig, right? That's basically a cow that's being cooked there. And you can see the expertise of the cook. The other gentleman on the right is a guy from Denver. His name is Daddy Bruce. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. Yeah. So Daddy Bruce, yeah. Now, he wasn't a clergy person, but he was a deeply religious man and a well-known barbecuer in Denver. And so I included him in my book because he's a guy who lived out his faith. And one of the things he was known for is every Thanksgiving holiday he would feed thousands of people, sometimes up to 5,000, maybe even more. And so he gained a lot of notoriety and press around the country because of his barbecue. So,
Right.
I just talk about kind of barbecue and church culture. Now, there is something about the combination of African American pastors smoking meat, and I don't know why they feel called to preach the word of God and smoke meat, but there's definitely there's something going on there. And I would say if there's a holy land for church barbecue, it's definitely Texas. The most
Mm.
uh, the most black pastors I found doing barbecue were in Texas. And then I talked about the kind of the independent barbecuers who will go around the country introducing Southern barbecue. And so this is one of my favorite characters in the whole book. This is a guy named Columbus B. Hill. He winds up in Colorado. He's from West Tennessee. He leaves West Tennessee in the 1870s. He arrives in Colorado in the early 1880s. And pretty soon, he's doing barbecue on the regular for 5,000 people. In fact, when the state capitol in Colorado was dedicated and the cornerstone was laid in July 4th, 1890, 25,000 people showed up for a barbecue in Lincoln Park in front of the state capitol. And so this is an illustration of him that was in the major newspaper, the Denver Post. So he did a barbecue for 25,000 people that day. He at the end of the decade and for the Denver Stock Show, he did a barbecue for 30,000 people. Now that was not a good thing because the barbecue was originally a VIP event only for 5,000 people, but the word got out in the seedy part of town, and then 30,000 people showed up, and there actually was a food riot, and he was of it. On the other side of the pandemic, I'm gonna get back to raising money, and I'm gonna have a headstone for him so we can basically show just show how significant this guy was to barbecue culture. Did I freeze there for a minute? I was
Yes.
just curious. Did I freeze?
For a moment, yes.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So all I was saying is, yeah, okay. All I was saying is that I found this guy's unmarked grave in Denver, and I'm raising money to get him a gravestone. So once we
Wow.
get on the other side of the pandemic, I'll do that. And then I talked about barbecue business. So on the left is a guy named Henry Perry. He's the acknowledged father of Kansas City barbecue. He shows
Mm.
up around 1905, but this is the guy who trains Arthur Bryant, Gates, all of those guys that we think of now with barbecue with Kansas City barbecue. He was the guy that got him started. And if you look on this ad, you can see that it wasn't just pork. He's serving possum, hog, groundhog, raccoon, beef, pork, mutton. All of these things are involved. So the idea that African Americans are just pork barbecue, this doesn't hold up to historical scrutiny. The woman on the left is a woman named Ernestine Vandeval, and she is from the historic town of Nicodemus, Kansas. And so she grows up there. And if you don't know about Nicodemus, it was a town founded by formerly enslaved people in the 1870s. It's one of the oldest black communities in the United States. And she left as a young woman and went to Pasadena, California, and actually ran a barbecue restaurant and soul food joint in Pasadena. She catered for Walt Disney. I guess he loved her food. And if you remember the movie Car Wash in the 1970s, the car wash that they used to film that movie, she used to hang out in the parking lot and sell barbecue there as well. So she comes back to Nicodemus and late in life, and she ends up running a barbecue restaurant. I actually got to have some of the food there, not from her, but from her niece, Angela Bates, who is one of the few people left in Nicodemus. It's a dying town, and she's doing a lot to keep the legacy of Ernestine Vanderwall alive. But I talk about the challenges that African Americans face in business. Typically, like other black entrepreneurs, they don't have enough money to get their business started, keep it going, and so it's been a real struggle for a lot of African American barbecuers. And then sauce. So in African American culture, barbecue sauce is huge. Now there's a growing conventional wisdom that barbecue should be unsauced. And African Americans, I'm safe to say, will say, well, who says who? Because mostly we have sauce. So on the left hand side, we've got Arthur Bryant, when he died in 1982. This was the editorial cartoon that was put into the local newspaper where he's at the pearly gates with St. Peter, and St. Peter asks him if he brought the sauce. And on the right hand side, you have an ad from a newspaper in 1902. And the reason why I show you this ad is even though there was a lot of caricature of African Americans in the press at this time, here we have an ad where basically this African American is treated with dignity. He's depicted as an expert. He's working over this traditional barbecue that's prepared in a trench. And so I just thought it was interesting to show this dignified portrait. What should have happened that never did is I don't know why there wasn't an Aunt Jemima or Uncle Ben or Faustus equivalent of an African American in barbecue, because the association was so strong, but that just never really happened. This is really as close as we ever get. And this barbecue sauce was only on the market for a short period of time. It didn't really last that long. And then I talk about competition barbecue. So competition barbecue is huge now. And I'm a certified barbecue judge in the Kansas City Barbecue Society. And this is how I became a judge. I was reading the newspaper and I saw this ad, come be a barbecue judge. And I thought it would help me with my soul food research because so many soul food joints have a barbecue option. So I walked into a room at the Adams County Fairgrounds in July of 2004. There were about 70 people in the room. I was the only dude under 250 pounds. As I like to say, I was the only dude under 250. So I was like, okay, this is my future. And, what they do is they walk you through the competition process. So in the Kansas City Barbecue Society, there are 4 categories. Beef, which is usually brisket, pork, which is usually pork shoulder, pork spare ribs, and chicken. And you grade it on a 9-point scale for taste, texture, and appearance. And so what they do is they go through all the rules, and there's arbitrary rules in all of these barbecue societies. So in the Kansas City Barbecue Society, you can only, for example, present your barbecue on 3 certified greens: green leaf lettuce, flat leaf parsley, or cilantro. So if you made the best barbecue in the world, but you presented it on collard greens, disqualified. So after they go through all the rules, they start bringing out barbecue samples, and then they give you something illegal just to make sure that you are up on the rules. And if you missed it, they would have said, well, Adrian, you should have noticed this. And then you stand up and you take a barbecue oath. It's a sacred thing, and I'm not going to repeat it because I know some people here are going to mock it. And then you get your badge in the mail. And once you get your badge in the mail, you can go judge any contest under that sanctioning body. So here's the challenge. When I became a judge in 2004, I was judge number 2,625. You have to recertify every 5 years. And 5 years ago, when I was looking into this, because I should have recertified last summer, but the pandemic threw that out of whack. They were already up to 70,000 judges. So it's like winning the lottery now. If you're not at your computer watching when they announce a judge position is open, you're just out of luck. So it's really popular now. So I pretty much only do celebrity judging. So a couple weeks ago, I was on the Drew Barrymore show, judging some barbecue from Joe's Kansas City in Kansas City, the Rendezvous in Memphis, and a place called King's Barbecue in Kinston, North Carolina. But the person here is named Sylvie Curry. She's one of the most recognized people on the barbecue circuit. And if you have Netflix, there's a show called American Barbecue Showdown. She's on the show. I'm not going to give it away, but let's just say she'll make you hungry and proud watching her compete. And then the last chapter is really on, second to last chapter is just on African American media representation when it comes to barbecue. So the woman on the far left is named Helen Turner. She is a one-woman barbecue operation in a place called Brownsville, Tennessee. So like an hour, about 40 minutes west of Memphis. You don't hear much about her, but she does everything. She's cooking barbecue, tending the fire, shoveling the coals, making the sides, all of that stuff. The woman in the middle, she was actually the winner of the first Memphis in May competition. Her name is Bessie Mae Cathay, and she just won with a very basic setup. So back in the early days of the contest, it's not like it is today. I mean, now it's all corporate, right? You have people with $5,000 to $10,000 rigs doing all their thing, but she won with a very basic setup. Black woman won the first Memphis in May. And then the next gentleman here, he is actually from Kentucky, and I feature him in my book. And Mr. Smith here is a well-known barbecuer who actually influenced other barbecuers in his region. and you don't hear much about him. You hear about the people that he influenced and taught, but not much about him. So my book is about changing this narrative. And then I talk about the future of barbecue. And so I include Mary and Deborah Jones. If you're a fan of Queer Eye, they were on an episode last season, and they got so much love after that episode that their business has really taken off. And so I just talk about what are the challenges now for barbecuers, and what will the future be like for them. And then one thing, just the barbecue's future. The Jones sisters have come up with a barbecue vending machine, which I think is brilliant. So
Wow.
imagine just being like, yeah, they've got sandwiches, their sauce, all that stuff. Isn't that the coolest idea?
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Yep.
How
So let's
industrious.
just quickly, yeah, let's just quickly go through some African American barbecue specialties that you may not know about. So you've probably heard a lot about burnt ends. Burnt ends are the charred ends of the basically the charred part of brisket that's cooked when it's been smoked for a long time. It has a clear origin story. So it was created by Arthur Bryant, this guy on top, who ran a legendary barbecue joint in Kansas City. I mentioned his sauce in the obituary earlier. He died in 1982. But what he did, nobody's sure when this first started, but what he would do is he would basically, and a lot of barbecuers did that, when they were slicing or chopping brisket, they often didn't include that charred part. A lot of people threw that away. So what he decided to do was just chop it up, put it in basically a bowl, and put it on the counter, and customers could just get some of that burnt ends as they were waiting for their food. Doesn't sound like the most hygienic practice, but that's what they did. And so that's where burnt ends start. And so now burnt ends have become gentrified, right? Instead of being just like shards of crispy, fatty meat, now they're perfectly manicured cubes that are sold for a lot of money. So that's burnt ends is definitely an African American thing from Kansas City. Pork spare ribs. I would say if there's the iconic item, it would be pork spare ribs. And in soul food culture, the spare ribs usually have the rib tip attached. So it's not something that is cut off. There's this thing called the St. Louis cut, where they take off the rib tip and to give it a more uniform and rectangular appearance. But African Americans, usually when you go to an African American rib joint, the rib tip is attached. Chopped pork is also very popular. This is a pork sandwich from Payne's in Memphis. This, I would say, this is the platonic form of a barbecue sandwich. It's a chopped pork sandwich with a mustard slaw. Man, this is so amazing. I can't even tell you. Chicken is also very popular in African American barbecue. And then hot links. Hot links are a sausage that's usually coarsely ground and very, very spicy. And you see that all over the place. So, right now we're beholden to a lot of regional barbecue styles, but in African American barbecue, there's much more play. And what I find is there are much more standardized items offered regardless of where you are in the country. Now, I would say pork ribs, chicken, and hot link sausages are those things. Also very popular is rib tips. So as I mentioned earlier, in order to create the St. Louis cut, rib tips are now featured all over the place. But it is typical in Chicago. In fact, I would say the Chicago regional barbecue style in the South Side, which is predominantly black, is rib tips, French fries, and a whole bunch of sauce, and usually some white bread too. Another thing you may not have heard of are Monroe County pork steaks, and these are in kind of southern Kentucky. So this is essentially taking the pork butt cut, but while it is still frozen, using a saw to cut it into thin steaks, and then these are basically grilled and spicy barbecue sauce is put on those. So that's something you see more in black joints in southern Illinois. And then going to Memphis, which I think has a lot of the weirdest soul food stuff. Barbecue bologna. And so the way you make barbecue bologna is you get one of those that tube of bologna, you cut it, you slit it, so you're stabbing it really to put slits in it. And then what they do is they put it on the smoker for a few hours to let some smoke infuse it. And then when somebody orders this sandwich, what they do is they cut off about an inch or a half inch to an inch thick piece. They put it on a griddle to get some char on it, and then it's white bread or a bun, bologna, coleslaw, sauce, bun. It's incredible. I know it doesn't sound that way, but it's incredible. And then the last thing I'll tell you about is barbecue spaghetti. If you've never heard of barbecue spaghetti, it's another special from Memphis. Here's how you make barbecue spaghetti. Instead of marinara, you use barbecue sauce, and then you add grilled meat and some special seasonings. And you bring that all together for barbecue spaghetti. It is amazing. I know it sounds nasty. I know you're skeptical, but I'm going to tell you, it is amazing. So that's Black Smoke coming out in late April. That's my sneak preview. And you can find me at soulfoodscholar.com or on Instagram and Twitter at soulfoodscholar. And you can pre-order the book. And if you pre-order it, you can get it autographed. And you'll get it sometime in early May. So thank you so much for this time. And I'm happy to take your questions.
So if any of you have any questions, we're happy, to permit you to turn on your camera or unmute yourself to speak directly with Mr. Miller. And so while we're waiting on questions, back to the legacy of Daddy Bruce in Denver. One thing that I would often hear is people would say, Daddy Bruce was a wonderful man, but I hated his barbecue. And that's because most of the Denverites, did not like that North Carolina, vinegar-based barbecue.
For some reason, it's better or different or something.
Okay, is there somebody who is asking a question?
I think they didn't mute. I think they've muted now, so I think we're good.
Okay. So Helen wants to know, what is your favorite sauce?
Oh, by far my favorite commercial sauce is Gates. Gates barbecue sauce out of Kansas City. That's by far my favorite commercial sauce. But I got to tell you, in terms of being in a restaurant, there's a place called Jenkins Quality Barbecue in Jacksonville, Florida. They have a mustard-based sauce, which is amazing. And so that's my favorite restaurant sauce. But in terms of getting something at the store, it's definitely Gates.
And so, as you know, states, who has the monopoly of barbecue is just as contentious as NFL teams. You have Kansas, you have Tennessee, you have North Carolina. I think I mentioned Texas. So, who, in your opinion, whose barbecue? What state is superior?
So my top places in terms of barbecue is I'm a Kansas City guy. That's my favorite, and I think that's a function of growing up in Denver because that was the strongest influence. And then I would say second is Memphis. And then third is kind of East Texas. And then fourth, I actually like East North Carolina barbecue, which is not something that you hear about a lot. But because I think a lot of people are getting bad North Carolina barbecue. So they're getting a nasty version of it. But if somebody knows what they're doing, the vinegar is added throughout the cooking process. So it's very subtle. It's not overpowering, and it really adds depth of flavor to the meat. And then fifth, I would say, would be Central Texas barbecue style. So when people say Texas barbecue, I break it down into different regions. There's East Texas, like Houston, Beaumont. There's Central Texas, Austin, Luling, Lockhart. And then there's South Texas, which is more of a Latino-influenced barbacoa culture.
Okay. Well, somebody wanted to know top 5 cities for best barbecue.
So cities, I would go Kansas City, Memphis, Chicago.
Okay. Chicago.
Yeah. Houston, and then Austin.
Now, someone else wanted to know, did you visit Rodney Scott in Charleston, South Carolina?
Absolutely. And so the funny thing is, the day that I went to Rodney Scott Barbecue and I interviewed him, Senator Kamala Harris was there on a campaign stop. So I was one table away from her during her campaign stop. So yeah, I did go there. And I loved his barbecue. He's doing amazing stuff. But the thing that surprised me is I really loved his ribs. Because when you hear about Rodney Scott, he's more associated with whole hog barbecue. But man, his ribs were really good.
Something that kind of gives me hope when you talk about how the pandemic, how many of the black-owned barbecue restaurants have folded through the pandemic. What gives me hope is Jones Barbecue in Marianna, Arkansas, and that is the oldest. Actually, not so much barbecue. That is the oldest black-owned restaurant in the United States, and it's a barbecue a small little barbecue pit in rural Arkansas, and it's been owned by multiple generations. It's James Beard award-winning restaurant, and they've been there since what, 1915?
Yeah. So actually, there's a dispute as to whether it's the oldest because there's a place in East Texas called Patillo's, and we're pretty sure that they've been operating since 1912. So
It's called Patillo's. Okay.
Patillo's, Patillo. Yeah. So it's cool. But yeah, I've been to that place. I've been to Jones Barbecue, and it's a simple menu. You just get a chopped pork, white bread, chopped pork, slaw, bun, white bread, right? That's all you get. And so, one thing is I didn't see anybody helping that guy, maybe his wife. And so when he calls it quits, man, I don't know if there's somebody ready to step in. And so that's one of the things that, is worrisome when it comes to a lot of these black barbecue businesses.
And you had mentioned, about how barbecue, certain parts of barbecue is becoming kind of gentrified, and we're finding that with the whole black culinary tradition. Like one thing, like simple foods like grits. I mean, you find grits at 5-star restaurants, and they've made it into a gourmet food. Would you elaborate more on how the black barbecue tradition is kind of undergoing gentrification?
Yeah, so I think one thing is just looking at the way that the emphasis on meat. So a perfect example is burnt ends. So seriously, burnt ends were the charred bits that nobody wanted, and that's what was given as just like an extra thing. And now everybody is creating burnt ends that are Instagrammable, perfectly manicured, and charging a lot of money. So the burnt ends is no longer the shards, right? It's actually some of the meat. And also we have people coming into barbecue now that are telling people that they have to have high-end meat. Like instead of, like you have to use Wagyu or Kobe beef or prime. And who says that? Why do you have to do that? I mean, barbecue was not really about that. So those are the big ways that I see it being gentrified, is really the way that meat is discussed, and the push to have really high-end meat as part of barbecue. Now, a fine dining chef, of course they're going to say have the best meat possible. But before that, a barbecue cook was just like, give me a good animal and I can do some things with this. And so it's driven up the prices, right? And so, you've got barbecue joints where you're now paying $30 a pound. You're paying $24 for a slab of ribs. And, in a black-owned entrepreneurs, especially in a black neighborhood, they cannot charge those prices.
And this is not so much part of the whole barbecue tradition, but you're finding that with meat that used to be cheap, like oxtails.
Yep. It's all part of the same thing, right? Once things get discovered, all of a sudden, it just gets pricey. And actually, the funny thing is that if you look at old newspapers from the 1960s, after soul food first became really popular, same thing happened. You've got interviews of African Americans saying, I can't have pig's feet anymore, or ham hocks, because they're too expensive.
Okay, so here are a couple more questions. Someone else wanted to know, what are some cooking tips for a good barbecue tender steak, and what's the best beef cut for barbecue?
Wow. So, I have to admit something. I'm much better at eating barbecue than cooking it. So I don't really make steaks on the grill that much. I'm just a rib guy. So when I barbecue, I'm pretty much doing ribs, chicken, and hot links. To the question of the best cut, now this may sound unusual because I'm sure somebody's like, oh, he's going to say brisket. But as I ate my way through the country, I've definitely had some great brisket. But there's a cut called the beef clod, or the shoulder clod. It's one of the least expensive. It's taken from the shoulder. There's a lot of good meat and fat marbling. I would highly recommend that. That's probably something that you can get similar results to brisket without paying brisket prices, because brisket has gone through the roof.
Wow.
Yeah.
Next question. Maria says, great talk, Adrian. You mentioned Native American roots for barbecue and European meat cooking traditions. What about African culinary traditions? How have they influenced barbecue in the U.S.?
Yeah, so that's one thing I've been trying to figure out, because in my book, I wanted to say, hey, barbecue is West African in origin, and, go Wakanda forever. but I couldn't necessarily prove that. So I think what Africans bring to it is similar experiences with meat, not necessarily um, pit cooking, but certainly some grilling traditions, and I think the adept use of seasoning.
Mm,
Because even though barbecue is Native American in origin, developing it to what we call it today was definitely African American project. And so the use of seasoning and sauces and things like that, I think that's the African American signature for barbecue.
okay.
And the challenge is a lot of this stuff has not been well documented. So in some cases we're all guessing, but
Mm,
it's clear that barbecue goes on one trajectory once enslaved Africans and later enslaved African Americans are in charge of the cooking. In fact, a lot of the early commentary on barbecue talked about how spicy it was, and that's a
mm,
West African signature for sure.
mm. Adante Hart says, great presentation. And Adante, I think that's, yeah. Um, Adante wants to know, when you were doing research and conducting interviews for Black Smoke, what did you learn about the relationship between Black pitmasters and hog farmers back then and today?
Yeah, so back then, a lot of times they were often one and the same. And
Mm,
so what you found is that barbecue was a way to build community, especially in the rural South. And so people usually had some hogs, and they just took turns having
mm,
barbecue. So one neighbor would have one weekend, and then another neighbor the next weekend.
mm,
So with the rise of our industrial food system, there has been somewhat of a disconnect. And so barbecue people are relying on certain people to source their hogs. Now, what's happening lately, though, is we're finding more and more barbecue people really being conscious and intentional about where they get their hogs from, because they
mm,
want to know that they're getting good meat. They
mm,
want to know that some sustainable practices are being used. And so they're trying to get away from commodity hogs, commodity
mm,
pork. So a great question. I found like Ed Mitchell, who's a legendary barbecuer in North Carolina, in the Raleigh Durham area. He is being intentional about connecting with Black farmers. Rodney Scott, who was mentioned earlier, is working with Black farmers to get certain breeds of pigs. So we're seeing more connections there. It's just so hard for a barbecuer, unless they have those relationships, to break free of the commodity pork system because it's just so dominant. And they have costs. It takes money to connect with certain farmers, and it's the question is, can you pass that cost along to your customers? I'm not sure everybody can.
okay. Um, another viewer wants to know, indicates, I know salt was originally used as a preservative, but I'm concerned about the health impact. What lower sodium options result in good barbecue?
Oh yeah, I mean, I've the cool thing is there are a lot of barbecue rubs that have hit the market that are low or no sodium, and so people are really kind of skipping past the salt and trying to figure out how to use spices to achieve the same goal. So I've seen a lot of great spice rubs emerge. So I think you can find some on the market.
Mm,
Savory Spice Company is one. I don't know about the commercial rubs. Most of those do have salt. And I feel you, Helen, because I used to love salty barbecue. I'm just not feeling it so much anymore. So I'm on the search for low sodium sodium options, but there are definitely ones on the market. And some people are using like smoked paprika or smoked spices to enhance the flavor of their barbecue. So I'm sorry I couldn't give you a direct answer, Helen. I just can't. Nothing really comes to mind, but I know that there's some on the market.
so speaking of barbecue, I think let's go. What are your favorite sides with barbecue?
Yeah, so I love baked beans and coleslaw and potato salad. Those are my three favorites. So give me those and I'm pretty good. Now, you go to a lot of black run soul food joints and they'll have soul food sides, and I know other people argue for greens and macaroni and cheese. That's fine, but I just love something about coleslaw, potato salad, and
Uh,
baked beans, because barbecue reminds me of summer still. I know we have it all
yeah.
year round, but it still reminds me of summer, and I think of those with summer.
Well, and you could get excommunicated out the black race depending on how your potato salad is.
Right. So look, if you're somebody who thinks that raisins need to go on potato salad, we don't really need to hear from you right now.
So are you a mustard or mayonnaise based potato salad person?
I like a mix actually, but I'm more on the mustard side.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. So before we close, would you just give us, what are three major takeaways from the book that you want the reader to get?
So the first one is that barbecue, as we understand it, is Native American in origin. And the story that we're often told is the Caribbean root of barbecue, but that doesn't square with what happens in the American South. So I believe that barbecue is really based on what the indigenous people were cooking in Virginia, and then other things get added to that. Second is you have to understand that African Americans were the principal cooks for barbecue for 200 years. And they were barbecue's most effective ambassadors. For most people around the country, their first taste of authentic Southern barbecue was at the hands of an African American. And then in the 1990s, we get all away from this. We start the media, barbecue media, food media, starts to focus on white guys who barbecue. And I'm not saying that white guys can't barbecue. A lot of white guys make excellent barbecue. But the whole thing is that we get a skewed picture of the barbecue world. And so much so that African Americans get pushed to the sidelines. And I am trying to bring us back into the center of the barbecue narrative.
Mm-hmm. And so, and then you think that Kansas has the best barbecue.
I do. Now, my mind is starting to change, but still I'm holding on to that childhood nostalgia. But Memphis is right there. But I'm not going to lie. Texas, the East Texas and Central Texas barbecue traditions are gaining popularity with me. This is pretty good stuff.
But the Texas style barbecue, that's a dry rub style, right? So that's not really an African American style of barbecue.
Yeah, Central Texas. Because if you go to East Texas, it's very different. East Texas is messier, a lot of sauce, Creole seasonings. That's more African American. And that's the thing. That's another thing I'm pointing out in this book. When people say Texas, they automatically go to Central Texas.
They go to Austin. They go to Austin.
Yeah. But you gotta consider Beaumont and Houston. There's other places, and those are more African American influenced barbecue regions.
Well, Mr. Miller, it's been an honor and a privilege, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Adrian Miller, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. Happy Black History Month, and I hope you get some good barbecue soon.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. Have a good weekend, everybody. Thank you.